Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you hearing about this very important issue here in Rhode Island. I've got 4 points that I want to make fairly quickly here, and certainly one of those points will have several points which will address many of the questions that folks have had around the demographics of who we're talking about here. First of all, if folks aren't aware, we've recently released the Rhode Island Standard of Need. I'm with the Economic Progress Institute. This is a report that we do every 2 years. And what we see in that report is that in order for an individual, one person, to meet their basic needs in Rhode Island, they would need to be making $12.38 an hour. So clearly that's more than $9.60, it's more than $10.50. The good news is that we've been starting to see some sign of wage growth as we've been coming out of the recession. Low wages and very low wages have bumped up a little bit, as have median wages. That's all to the good. We've also seen some closing of the gap in those low wages between ourselves and the neighboring states in Connecticut and Massachusetts. And we attribute that significantly to the increases that we have seen in the minimum wage in recent years. One thing that's important to be aware of is that because of the impact of inflation, any year in which we do not increase the minimum wage, we are effectively giving our lowest paid workers in this state a wage cut. And for those who are concerned and want to talk about a 9% increase or whatever, we're talking about families that are making less than $20,000 a year. And clearly in a state like Rhode Island, that's not going to get you where you need to be. Another thing that's important to realize is that we've been doing a couple of things to help low-income folks in recent years, one of which has been to increase the earned income tax credit. And what you actually find is that the best way to help low-income folks is to both increase the earned income tax credit and increase the minimum wage. When you do those two things together, the impact is much larger. The folks that did the initial study that demonstrated this are at Perry, the Political Economy Research Institute at UMass. Jeannette Wicks-Lim, that was a study a few years ago, and certainly that speaks to the fact that we need to not think of these as sort of one this year, one next year. We want to keep pushing it forward so that we can get our families in Rhode Island closer to a wage where they can support themselves. There's been a question around job loss, and actually, if you look at all of the studies that have been done over the last decade or so, you will find some studies that say we gain jobs, and you'll find some studies that say we lose jobs, but the vast preponderance of those studies will show that the employment impact is not discernible from zero. In other words, there's really no effect on employment. Now, it's possible that if we were talking about raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour or $18 an hour, that you might see some job loss, but we're talking here about incrementally adjusting the minimum wage. And just so folks know, the minimum wage, yes, we have increased it, over the years, certainly in recent years. But if you inflation adjust that line, what you see is that we're at making about a dollar more, than we were in 2000 when you inflation adjust the numbers. So these are not numbers that are going through the roof, and they're certainly not numbers that are crippling the economy. So just to shift gears quickly here and talk a little bit about who it is that we're talking about. I believe the number that folks from the Department of Labor indicated, 78,000. Our numbers show, we work with the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. Our numbers show about 77,000 directly impacted, but then another 16,000 that benefit because of that cascading effect, because those whose wages are slightly above the minimum wage will also see an increase. So there you're looking at about 93,000 Rhode Island workers. Increasing their minimum wage to $10.50 would put about $65.2 million into their pockets and subsequently into the Rhode Island economy. Who are we talking about here? I think there's a lot of misconceptions about who minimum wage earners are. 61% of minimum wage earners are women. A much larger share of workers are older workers than I think we tend to think. There's actually more workers who are 55 and older than there are who are in those teen years. And actually, 65% of those that would benefit are 25 years of age or older. So we're not talking about kids, we're not talking about teenagers, we're talking about adults, many of whom are trying to provide for their families, put food on the table, etc. In fact, 45,000 Rhode Island children have a parent who would be affected by this minimum wage increase. That's a lot of kids, and we need to be doing better by our kids. 53% of those who would benefit are actually full-time workers. So yes, there are some part-time workers, but a majority are working full-time. There was a question around employment sectors. What we find is that 27% of those that would benefit are in the retail sector, 20% are in leisure and hospitality, and 19% are in health and education. And finally, I think there's a misconception around the education levels that we're talking about here. You'll often hear people saying, well, they need to get an education and get a better job. The fact is that 44% of those who would be benefiting from increasing the minimum wage have some college education or a college degree. And the education level of those at the low end has actually increased significantly over the last 25 years. That concludes my comments.